Hello everyone, welcome to this EUMENIA Lecture series. My name is Dimitris Bouris and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And today's lecture will focus on the European Union's role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's part of the lecture series of EUMENIA, which is a Jean-Monnet network co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the EU. Just to give you a little bit of background, in 1916, we had the Sykes-Picot Agreement. With this agreement, the Ottoman provinces of outside the Arabian Peninsula were divided into areas of British and French control and influence. Following that, in 1917, there was the Balfour Declaration, which promised the creation of a national home for the Jewish people. In 1947, Great Britain announced its withdrawal from these territories and transferred all responsibility for the final status to the United Nations. With Resolution 181, the United Nations decided upon the division of historic Palestine into two states, an Arab and a Jewish state, the internationalization of Jerusalem, and the financial aid for the parties. In 1948, we had the Israel Declaration of Independence, or as it's often called, Al-Nakba. And in 1967, we had the so-called Six-Day War, also called 1967 War, which is the war where the West Bank came for the first time into Israeli hands. The European community back then failed to adopt a common position on how to respond to this war. Until 1970, the European community had not put either the Middle East question or the issue of occupied land on its agenda. The first time that this happened was with the so-called Schuman document, which called for the Israeli withdrawal from all these occupied territories in return for recognition of Israel by the Arab states. This is also the first time that we see the term just peace mentioned. Following that, we had the 1973 war, where the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, decided to place an embargo on the European community, thus trying to exploit the oil weapon. The countries were classified, the European countries were classified as hostile, such as, for example, the Netherlands, neutral, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Ireland, Italy and Luxembourg, and friendly, France and the UK. After the so-called Yom Kippur War, the European community adopted two statements. The first one called for a ceasefire and the initiation of negotiations based on the United Nations Resolutions 242 and 338. And the second statement, for the very first time, recognizing the legitimate rights of the Palestinians. In 1977, we had yet another important declaration coming from the European community, the so-called London Declaration. And I quote, the Nine have affirmed their belief that a solution to the conflict in the Middle East will be possible only if the legitimate right of the Palestinian people to give effective expression to its national identity is translated into fact, which would take into account the need for a homeland for the Palestinian people. In the meantime, in 1978, we also had the signing of peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. And this takes us to the Venice Declaration of 1980. People have argued that this is probably the most important declaration which the EU has ever adopted with regard to this conflict. First of all, the declaration supported the Palestinian right to self-determination, and Article 7 explicitly said that the Palestinian people, which is conscious as such, must be placed in a position by an appropriate process defined within the framework of the Comprehensive Peace Settlement to exercise fully its right to self-determination. The Venice Declaration went further as to state that the European community would not accept any unilateral initiative designed to change the status of Jerusalem, and it also maintained that settlements, as well as modifications in population and property in the occupied Arab territories, are illegal under international law. The Venice Declaration was also, in a sense, visionary because it also called for the inclusion of the PLO into the negotiations, which was what eventually happened with the 1993 Oslo Accords. The Oslo process began after secret negotiations in Oslo, Norway, and they were based on a gradualist approach which aimed at creating a confidence-building environment. The PLO, which was led by Yasser Arafat, was recognized by Israel, the United States, and the whole international community as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. And at the same time, the PLO also recognized Israel's right to exist. One of the main elements of the Oslo Accords is that they created the Palestinian National Authority, and this is where we can talk about the first phase of Palestinian state building. And this is the famous picture from the signing of the Oslo Accords. You can see in the picture Bill Clinton, US president back then, Yitzhak Rabin, and Yasser Arafat. And you don't need me to tell you that the EU is absent from this picture, which on its own has quite a lot of significance. Despite this fact, the EU provided over half the funding needed that supported the setting up of the Palestinian Authority quasi-state institutions. Now, the reality which Oslo created has been described very well by Anne Lemore, and I quote, "The United States decides, the World Bank leads, the European Union pays, and the United Nations feeds." The Oslo Accords created also a very complicated reality on the ground. The West Bank was divided into areas A, B, and C. Area A, which is approximately 17.7% of the total of the West Bank, Palestinians would be responsible for both security and civilian matters. Area B, 21.3% of the total of the West Bank, there would be shared responsibility where the Palestinians would be responsible for civilian matters and the Israelis for security matters. And Area C, which is almost 61% of the total of the West Bank, Israel would be responsible for all matters. So the Oslo Accords created what has been called as a Swiss cheese, where Israel kept the cheese and left the holes to the Palestinians. Part of the Oslo Accords was also the Paris Protocol of 1994. As with the Oslo Accords, the Paris Protocol was also supposed to remain in force for an interim period. And what the protocol did is that, in essence, it integrated the Palestinian economy into the Israeli one through a customs union. 6 major areas were targeted: customs, taxes, labor, agriculture, industry, and tourism. Very simply, all this meant that all imports and exports would be subject to Israeli supervision and that Israel would control all borders. The Paris Protocol also created a system where a tax transfer system where Israel collected and passed to the Palestinian Authority the taxes and custom duties imposed on the Palestinian imports from or via Israel. Following the Oslo Accords created what a lot of people have also called the matrix of control, because 1/3 of the Palestinian Authority's budget revenues came from foreign aid, and the other 2/3 directly from revenues collected by Israel. And I remember in one of the interviews I have conducted for my own research with an Israeli academic, he told me back then that Oslo was a process, but it was not a peace process. It was probably the best process Israel could have subscribed to, as it permitted it to give orders to the Palestinians on what they have to do. By May 1999, Israel was still in full control of 71% of the total of the West Bank and 30% of the Gaza Strip. In the same year, 1999, the EU came with yet another declaration, the so-called Berlin Declaration. And I quote, "The EU is convinced that the creation of a democratic, viable, and peaceful sovereign Palestinian state would be the best guarantee of Israel's security." Now, this was a very important declaration because it put forward the idea of a two-state solution as the solution to this conflict. Between 2000 and 2003, we had the second Intifada, where a lot of what was built during the Oslo years was destroyed by Israel. And in 2002, we have yet another important declaration from the EU, the Seville Declaration. And I quote again, "The objective is an end to the occupation and the early establishment of a democratic, viable, peaceful, and sovereign state of Palestine on the basis of the 1967 borders, if necessary, with minor adjustments agreed by the parties." Now, this was also an important declaration because for the first time explicitly mentioned the 1967 borders. In parallel, in June 2002, we had the establishment of the so-called Quartet, comprised of the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and Russia. The Quartet adopted the so-called roadmap, and with the roadmap, we can say that the second phase of state building starts in Palestine. Now, the roadmap was initially an idea of the back then German Foreign Minister Fischer, and it was taken upon the Danish EU presidency and eventually adopted by the Quartet. And the logic of the roadmap was democracy now, peace later, which was quite opposite to the logic of the Oslo Accords, which was peace now, democracy later. The roadmap envisioned specific steps to be taken in parallel by both the Palestinian Authority and Israel, which would eventually, in the third and final stage, lead to full Palestinian statehood by the end of 2005. The next chapter on this are the 2006 Palestinian elections, and these elections were also part of the roadmap. The EU had also sent a monitoring mission to monitor the elections in Palestine. There have been several reports from official EU institutions commenting on the process of the elections. And I quote here a report from the Council of the European Union. The EU welcomes the successful holding on 25th of January of elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council. The Palestinian people have demonstrated a clear commitment to determine their political future via democratic means. These elections saw impressive voter participation in an open and fairly contested electoral process that was efficiently administered by an independent Palestinian Central Elections Commission. The successful holding of these elections is an important step in strengthening Palestinian democracy and implementing the Palestinian roadmap obligations. Hamas won these elections, and the EU refused to engage with the Hamas-led government, partly because Hamas is in the EU's list of terrorist organizations. In 2007, there was an effort to create a national unity government between Fatah and Hamas, and this eventually led to a split between the Fatah-led West Bank government and the Hamas-led Gaza Strip government. And this is also where the EU, alongside the international community, adopted the so-called West Bank First strategy or approach. Another effort to resolve the conflict was led by the United States in 2008 with the so-called Annapolis Conference, which was led and dominated by the United States without the EU really having much of a say in this process. In 2009, all these EU policies came under the same document with the Council conclusions, which summarized quite bluntly the EU's position with regard to the Middle East peace process. In 2010, the Council of the European Union also declared its readiness, when appropriate, to recognize a Palestinian state, but the parameters on which this appropriateness would be judged were never defined. In May 2011, US President Barack Obama, back then, also became the first US president to say that the final borders should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed shops. So someone can argue that the EU, throughout all these decades, has had some success in feeding the international community with different ideas, and that the EU has acted as a riding shotgun. And here I have a quote from Jonathan Tuval and Sharon Pardo, who argued that the Europeans were right. They were right to point out that solving the Arab-Israeli conflict required Israel to recognize Palestinian self-determination. They were right to call for bringing the PLO into the peace process. In fact, the European Declaration was not only right, but also visionary, in that it boldly spelled out the principles that such a comprehensive solution would require. And this slide here summarizes all this evolution of the EU policy with regard to this conflict from before 1970, where the conflict or the Palestinian rights are not even mentioned in any official European community documents, to slowly calling for the recognition of the legitimate rights of the Palestinians, introducing the idea of a homeland for the Palestinians, supporting the Palestinian right to self-determination, supporting the establishment of a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders. Now, this graph here shows the aid coordination structure, which was created to channel and coordinate aid in the occupied Palestinian territories. 4 different strategy groups had been created: the economic strategy group, the governance strategy group, the infrastructure strategy group, and the social development strategy group. Now, what is important to keep in mind from this graph is that the EU and EU member states are among the main donors to all these strategy groups, which in very simple words means that the EU and its member states are behind every aspect of the state building project conducted in Palestine. And this brings me to the so-called third phase of state building in Palestine, which started after the split between the Hamas-led government in Gaza and the Fatah-led government in the West Bank. Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, back then, he had come with a plan called Ending the Occupation, Establishing the State. Now, the plan was moving in two parallel tracks. On the one hand, Fayyad was trying to create positive facts on the ground, and on the other hand, the plan tried to build support at the international community level for the recognition of a Palestinian state. The plan had a 2-year duration, and the EU supported the plan by taking different initiatives, including the establishment of modern democratic police forces in the EU's rhetoric, institution building and good governance, sustainable growth of the Palestinian economy, and emergency and humanitarian purposes. In the end of this 2-year period, there were a number of reports which were produced by main international community institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and the EU itself. And the IMF, for example, argued that the PA was able to conduct the sound economic policies expected of a future well-functioning Palestinian state. The World Bank report argued that if the Palestinian Authority maintained its performance in institution building and delivery of public services, it would be well positioned for the establishment of a state at any point in the near future. The United Nations report also stated that in 6 areas where the United Nations is most engaged, governmental functions are now sufficient for a functioning government of a state. And on behalf of the EU, Catherine Ashton, who declared that today Palestinian institutions compare favorably with those in established states. And this led initially to the thought of the Palestinians asking for full recognition of statehood from the United Nations Security Council. When it became clear that the US would veto it, the Palestinians went to the United Nations General Assembly, and what they managed to do was to upgrade their status from non-member observer entity to non-member observer state. This is how EU member states voted. As you can see, there was a 3-way split. Let's put it like that. With the Czech Republic being the only EU member state voting against this bid. Now, a little bit on the EU's initiatives in the Palestinian state building. The EU has taken several initiatives in the domain of security sector reform. It deployed 2 common security and defense policy missions. The first one, EUPOL COPS, which is a police and rule of law mission, and the main aims of which are to assist the Palestinian civil police with providing mentoring and advice, to coordinate and facilitate EU members' financial assistance to the Palestinian civil police, to give advice on politically related criminal justice elements. Overall, someone can argue that the mission has been portrayed as a good success story, although this can be questioned, especially from a lot of people like myself who have done a lot of research on this mission itself. The second CSDP mission was a border assistance mission, which was deployed at the Rafah crossing point between Egypt and Gaza. And the idea of the mission was that it would assist the Palestinian Authority build capacity training on border management and customs, to contribute to the building institutional capacity in the PA to ensure effective border control, to contribute to the liaison between Palestinian, Israeli, and Egyptian authorities in all aspects of border management at Rafah. The mission has been inactive since Hamas's takeover of Gaza in 2007. And until today, EUBAM Rafah remains what an EU official described to me a sleeping beauty. In the domain of judiciary sector reform, the EU has taken a number of initiatives as well. There was a project called SEYADA, which ran between 2005 and 2012. And the project primarily targeted judicial training for staff, judges, and public prosecutors so as to help the Palestinian Authority meet the objectives of the Justice Now program. SEYADA 2, between 2009 and 2012, also targeted the High Judicial Council and the Palestinian Judicial Institute and the Palestinian Bar Association. And this brings us to some more relatively recent developments, the so-called guidelines and the labeling issue. In December 2012, the Council of the European Union declared its commitment to ensure that, in line with international law, all agreements between the State of Israel and the EU must unequivocally and explicitly indicate their inapplicability to the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, namely the Golan Heights, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. In 2013, we had the adoption of the so-called guidelines, which indicated that only Israeli entities having their place of establishment within Israel's pre-1967 borders would be considered eligible for EU funding. And in 2015, we had the initiative for the labeling of products originating from Israeli settlements. It's the so-called interpretative notice, which was issued in November 2015 on the indication of origin of goods from the territories occupied by Israel since 1967. Especially in the years of the Trump administration in the US, what we witnessed was an EU which was trying to resist politically to the end of multilateralism, let's say, by issuing different statements on the Israeli settlement policies and by also responding to Trump's unilateral initiatives of moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the Golan Heights as part of Israel, etc. And just to summarize all this a little bit on the EU's role in the Palestinian state building, someone can say that the EU state building project is rooted in the liberal peace building approach, which does not recognize power asymmetries. The EU's inability and unwillingness to acknowledge this power asymmetry, as well as challenge the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, is the main reason behind the limitations that the EU has faced with regard to its role as a state builder in the occupied Palestinian territories. The EU has prioritized technical assistance with a clear absence of clear political objectives. At the same time, though, this technical assistance also has political reverberations, such as, for example, what kind of state is being built, power without responsibility. Someone can also argue that through its different initiatives, the EU has intentionally or unintentionally enforced the existing status quo and the continuation of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. In the long term, one way or another, the EU has managed to keep alive, even if only on life support, a diplomatic process based on a two-state solution. While EU actions have not had any revolutionary or severe consequences, they could have the potential to evolve policy and lead to a shift from sustaining to resurrecting the so-called peace process. And I'll finish my lecture here. I would be more than happy to respond to any questions or comments you might have. You can find my contact details in the first introductory slide. Thank you for your attention.